If the Soviet Union lost its power and still had Russia left, the US would be in a different boat. If it loses its dominance, it's got nothing left. The diverse immigrants are drawn together by the big benefits that US power brings them. Once those perks run out, the folks singing America's praises will be the first to bail. The fuel of the American melting pot isn't the democracy and freedom it claims to stand for, but the dollar. When there's plenty of dollars, American democracy and freedom seem great, but when the dollars run low, the American spirit and even America itself can crash down hard. This has already played out once back in the Roman Empire. Just like Rome, America is a superpower built on a predatory economy. Let's take another look at the remnants of the Roman Empire, buried deep in the history of fate. Over 2,000 years ago, Roman citizens enjoyed public facilities and benefits that many modern countries would envy. Even regular Romans could live in subsidized housing provided by the government and wealthy patrons, grab free bread in the square, and catch free shows at the theater and gladiator arenas during festivals. On the streets of Rome, there are plenty of public baths and gyms. They enjoy hefty government subsidies, which keeps the prices super low. Plus, the government regularly hands out grants, so regular Romans can still get the chance to enjoy these luxury facilities. Whenever the Roman legions celebrated a victory, they would bring back tons of loot. To boost their reputation, the victorious generals would hand out some of that wealth to Roman citizens. Once you had Roman citizenship, you could enjoy the public services like sanitation, culture, and entertainment that came with it, sharing in the benefits of Roman dominance. So, Roman citizens had an extraordinary sense of pride and identity about their status and their country. During the Republic, only Roman citizens could join the Roman legions. For them, serving wasn't just a duty, it was more like a privilege. Their fierce spirit and strict discipline made the Roman legions the most powerful military force in Europe at that time. They called themselves civilized and referred to the people around them as uncivilized savages, justifying their plundering of wealth. Every time the Roman legions conquered a place, they set up provinces there, but the people in those provinces weren't considered Roman citizens. Their only value was paying taxes to Rome. The Roman government would auction off the rights to tax various routes, and the highest bidder would win. The winner had to pay the taxes up front to the Roman government and then got the right to collect taxes from the locals. This system is known as tax farming. It supported generous welfare for Roman citizens and fostered strong national identity. Citizens also provided high-quality, loyal recruits for the Roman legions. Ultimately, these powerful legions ensured military protection for the predatory hegemony. If you replace all these elements with those of modern America, you'll find that it still holds true. The US has the strongest military in the world, with over 300 bases spread across more than 140 countries. They also have 12 aircraft carrier groups patrolling the globe. Economically, the US uses methods like inflation and taxes to siphon off global wealth, which helps fund its massive military budget and provide high benefits for its citizens, easing domestic tensions and maintaining social stability and political support. In this system, the US makes up 6% of the world's population but consumes 35% of the world's resources. On average, each American uses 35 times more resources than someone in India and 13 times more than someone in China. This is a messed up system where some people are born into privilege while others are born into servitude. Logically, it seems like this could go on forever. But once something goes wrong in that system, those civilized folks living behind their high walls will realize that their proud civilization is just a dressed-up version of savagery. The freedom they brag about every day is built on luxury born from plunder, and the morals they preach are full of greed and selfish desires. In 147 BC, the Roman general Scipio wiped out Carthage, with the Roman legions going door to door to find every Carthaginian man, woman, and child, and kill them all. The city of Carthage was leveled to the ground and disappeared from history forever. From that point on, there was no country along the Mediterranean that could stand up to Rome. However, when the soldiers who had been fighting for years finally returned home, they found that their land had already been sold to nobles by their starving families. They had no choice but to flood into the cities looking for work. Meanwhile, the war had brought a ton of free slaves to the Roman nobles, which squeezed the job opportunities for city residents. The benefits of power were all being hoarded by those in high positions, and more Roman citizens were falling into poverty. Their sense of identity and loyalty to the state took a serious hit because of this. If things keep getting worse, the strength of the Roman legions will take a hit, and that looting-based economy won't hold up, leading to the whole system collapsing. In 134 BC, the popular leader Tiberius Gracchus was elected as the tribune of the plebs. To save Rome from crisis, he launched a reform to redistribute land from the nobles to the poor. The following year, Tiberius and his 300 supporters were murdered by the Senate. 11 years later, Tiberius's brother Gaius Gracchus was elected tribune, trying to carry on his brother's reform efforts. The following year, the Senate sent in the army and wiped out Gracchus and his 3,000 followers, which pretty much crushed the reform movement. To deal with the manpower issue, Rome started bringing in non-citizens into the military and heavily relied on mercenaries. While this did help boost their fighting strength, the newly formed Roman legions and mercenary groups didn't really fit in with the mainstream Roman society. Their makeup was also pretty non-Roman, and they had very limited loyalty to the state. They were more loyal to the leaders who paid them than to Rome itself. Even though the mercenaries helped Rome thrive again with their strong military power, warlords quickly became the most important political force in Rome. Military coups became a big problem for the country. In 476 AD, the leader of the Roman mercenaries, the Germanic Odoacer, overthrew the Emperor Romulus Augustulus, marking the fall of the Western Roman Empire. When we look at the US, we can see that the empire's system of dominance has run into similar issues. Since the 1970s, American capitalists have been moving manufacturing to developing countries with cheaper labor to boost profits. But this has meant that incomes for the middle and lower classes in the US haven't really budged. Since 1989, household income has been stuck around $60,000, and when you factor in inflation, most Americans have actually seen their living standards decline over the past 30 years. At the same time, the wealth of American billionaires keeps on growing. In 2019, the top 10% of the wealthiest people in the US held 70.7% of all the wealth, while the bottom 50% only had 1.5%. This shows that the benefits of the system are mostly going to the big capitalists and not trickling down to the everyday folks. It's strikingly similar to how the Roman aristocracy's mass land grabs led to widespread poverty among the lower classes back in the day. You could say that the main reason for the recent social unrest in the US is the severe wealth gap, and issues like racial discrimination and the COVID-19 pandemic have just sped up the explosion of social tensions. If the Black Lives Matter movement is really about fighting for racial equality, it doesn't make sense that a campaign against racism turned into one that revolves around looting. The US today needs a major reform, like the Gracchi brothers pushed for, to ensure that the benefits of power actually reach the lower classes. But just like the Roman Senate, the big capitalists here will do everything they can to block any real change. Without a strong leader stepping in, America's dominant order is inevitably headed for decline. Unlike in ancient times, modern military forces have firepower that far exceeds that of ordinary people or hastily armed civilians. A violent revolution fueled by the discrimination against farmers is almost impossible. To predict how the US might head towards turmoil, we need to look closely at its military organization and system. The US has an all-volunteer military, meaning they recruit soldiers as employees. Military life is tough, so most soldiers come from lower-income backgrounds, with only a few really wanting a military career. They usually sign up for 2 to 3 years, which isn't enough time for an average soldier to gain the experience needed for promotion to officer. So, where do all the high-ranking officers come from? The answer is that the most famous military academies are West Point, the US. Army Military Academy, the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy, and the Marine Corps University. These schools are where the US trains its elite officers. The admission standards are really high, and you need a solid recommendation to even apply. Having members of Congress or active duty generals in charge basically shuts the door for kids from poor backgrounds to get into the upper ranks of the military. This way, the ruling class in America keeps tight control over all levels of military command. Without a network of officers organizing things, it's really unlikely for just the soldiers to spark a military uprising. So, is there a chance we might see something like the North-South conflict again? Probably not. These days, the federal government's military power is way stronger than it was 160 years ago. The U.S. Department of Defense oversees about 1.38 million active duty military personnel across the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. However, state governments can only directly command the National Guard, which totals around 440,000 members, averaging less than 10,000 per state. There's a huge gap when you compare that to the federal military forces. Even though it's tough to find potential resistance within the U.S. military, history shows there are examples of successful uprisings without massive military struggles. Take India's non-violent resistance movement, for instance. The British didn't give up their colonial rule over India out of a sudden change of heart, otherwise, they would have returned the Falkland Islands to Argentina. The real reason was that the non-violent resistance disrupted social order to the point where the cost of managing the colony outweighed the profits. If we shift our focus from the national level to local communities, we can see that some impoverished neighborhoods in the U.S. are in a similar situation, marked by weak violence and a lack of cooperation. In major cities, there are struggling black neighborhoods that even the police hesitate to enter. These areas are often referred to by some white people as black towns or even more derogatory terms. People living here have stepped away from mainstream society and are mostly surviving through illegal activities like robbery and drug dealing. If the government organizes a large-scale hunt for them, they just break into smaller groups to evade capture. Even if they end up getting caught, life in prison might actually be better than outside. While they can't really match the firepower of the state, they have the advantage of being integrated with the local community. It costs a lot for the police or military to maintain order, and once the state's forces leave the community, it usually falls back under their control. After the Black Lives Matter movement kicked off, some people started using it as an excuse to boldly storm into stores and loot under the guise of seeking justice for black individuals. This kind of low-level chaos is really expensive to manage. California's Proposition 47, which decriminalized thefts or robberies under $950, is a result of the police being stretched thin in overcrowded jails. If the U.S. government can't get a grip on the growing inflation, it's only going to get worse. The manufacturing industry keeps moving overseas, and the gap between the rich and poor just keeps getting bigger. As more people fall into extreme poverty, more will join in on movements that resort to violence and non-cooperation. Since poor black folks are robbing poor white, Latino, and even Asian communities, it's only natural that these problems will spread like a cancer through society, releasing toxins that disrupt normal community life and driving up costs for businesses and government operations. Until the U.S. government can't keep the stable social environment that capital needs to thrive, money will start to rush out of the country, affecting tax revenues. Once the U.S. struggles to support its huge military spending and its military power weakens, that's when we'll hit the tipping point for its dominance. The U.S. is the biggest debtor with a staggering $22.6 trillion in foreign debt. When the U.S. was the world's top power, no one worried about it being unable to pay up. Even if they were concerned, they didn't dare to ask for repayment. But once America's dominance fades, creditors will suddenly realize that just like the Qing dynasty had to use tariffs as collateral for loans, why should the U.S. debt not require any collateral? When Americans are burdened with high taxes to pay off national debt, the increasingly impoverished citizens will realize that the lofty values they once championed have lost their appeal. The truth is, the gathering of 320 million people from different cultural backgrounds, skin colors, and lifestyles was driven by self-interest, not the so-called freedom. If it were truly about freedom, the vast African savanna would be the paradise immigrants dream of. When Americans are leaving this land for a better life and all 50 states are eager to break away from the federal government to escape debt, there won't be much left of the country.